They believed her story without question. Even my own son never asked if a single word of it was true. The first time I realized something was terribly wrong was during what should have been an ordinary Sunday dinner. My name is Helen Carter. I was 68 years old, widowed for nearly 5 years, and until that evening, I believe my family knew exactly who I was. The dining room was warm with the smell of roasted chicken and fresh dinner rolls. Sunlight filtered through the large windows of Ethan and Vanessa's suburban home outside Columbus, Ohio. My grandson was upstairs playing video games. The television hummed softly in the family room. Everything looked normal. That was what made it so frightening. Vanessa sat quietly at first, pushing food around her plate. She looked tired. Her eyes were red. I remember feeling concerned. I asked if she was feeling okay. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down and took a slow breath. Then she started crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make everyone stop talking. Ethan immediately turned toward her. "Honey, what's wrong?" he asked. Vanessa wiped her eyes and shook her head. "I don't know if I should say anything," she whispered. The room became completely silent. I felt a strange knot form in my stomach. Looking back, maybe some part of me already knew. Maybe mothers always know when a storm is coming. Ethan reached for her hand. "You can tell us anything." Vanessa nodded slowly. Then she looked directly at me. What happened next changed everything. She told them I had spent years criticizing her behind her back. She claimed I called her controlling. She said I told friends she wasn't good enough for my son. She said I tried to turn family members against her. Each accusation landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread across every face at the table. My sister-in-law looked shocked. Ethan looked confused. Vanessa continued speaking through tears, carefully choosing every word. I sat there frozen, trying to understand what I was hearing. None of it was true. Not one sentence. Yet nobody interrupted her. Nobody questioned her. Nobody looked at me and asked if I wanted to respond. They simply listened, as if her tears were evidence, as if emotion alone could replace truth. When she finally stopped speaking, the silence felt heavier than before. Ethan stared down at his plate. My heart pounded in my chest. I waited for him to laugh and say there had been some misunderstanding. I waited for him to defend me. Instead, he spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "Mom, if Vanessa feels this way, there must be a reason." Those words hurt more than all the accusations combined. Not because he believed her, because he believed her first. I looked around the table. No one met my eyes. The woman who had hosted holidays for 30 years suddenly felt like a stranger in the room. I could have argued. I could have listed every sacrifice, every birthday party, every favor, every dollar I had given to help build their lives. But something stopped me. I simply nodded, folded my napkin, and stood up. "I think it's time for me to go home," I said. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me outside. As I drove through the quiet streets toward my small house, the sun disappeared below the horizon. For the first time in my life, I understood something painful. A lie doesn't need proof when the right person tells it. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this story wasn't over. It was only beginning. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For years, that had been my routine. I would make coffee, sit by the kitchen window, and watch the neighborhood slowly come to life. Usually, the quiet felt comforting. That morning, it felt different. The silence seemed heavier somehow. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and stared out at the empty street. My phone sat on the table beside me. I kept glancing at it, expecting a message from Ethan. A call, an apology, even a simple question asking if I was all right. Nothing came. By 8 o'clock, I knew nothing was coming. I tried to keep busy. I watered the flowers on my front porch. I folded laundry. I reorganized a drawer that did not need organizing. Every task felt mechanical. My mind kept replaying the dinner conversation. The words, the looks, the silence. More than once, I caught myself wondering if I should have defended myself. Maybe I should have spoken up. Maybe I should have challenged every accusation the moment it was made. But deep down, I knew it would not have mattered. Vanessa had not simply told a story. She had prepared one. The following week revealed something even more painful. Small things began happening. The kind of things that might seem meaningless on their own. Ethan usually called every Wednesday evening. That call never came. My grandson, Noah, normally sent me photographs from his baseball practices. My inbox remained empty. On Friday afternoon, I stopped by the bakery where I often met my sister-in-law Carol for coffee. She seemed distracted. Nervous. She smiled when she saw me, but it was the kind of smile people use when they do not know what to say. We sat at our usual table near the front window. For several minutes, we talked about the weather and local traffic. Neither of us mentioned Sunday dinner. Finally, Carol lowered her voice. Helen, maybe it would be best if everyone had a little space right now. I looked at her carefully. Space from what? She looked down at her coffee cup. That told me everything. Vanessa's story had already traveled farther than I realized. When I returned home that afternoon, I walked through my front door and felt a strange emptiness settle over me. My house was not large, just a modest two-bedroom home with white shutters and a small backyard garden. But it had always felt warm, safe. Now it felt like a place where I was waiting for something bad to happen. The following Sunday was Noah's soccer game. I had attended nearly every game for the past 4 years. I packed a folding chair into my car and drove to the field. The autumn air was cool. Parents lined the sidelines holding coffee cups and blankets. I searched the crowd until I spotted Ethan. Beside him stood Vanessa. She saw me first. Her expression changed immediately. She leaned toward Ethan and whispered something. Within seconds, both of them turned and walked toward the opposite side of the field. They did not wave. They did not acknowledge me. I remained in my chair and watched the game alone. Noah scored a goal during the second half. Normally, he would have looked for me in the crowd afterward. This time he stayed close to his parents. As families gathered near the parking lot, I sat quietly for a moment before standing. The distance between us no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate. And for the first time, a difficult thought entered my mind. Vanessa had not started this story at that dinner table. She had simply chosen that moment to reveal it. The real story had been building for much longer. I just had not seen it yet. Over the next several days, I started noticing things I would have overlooked before. The changes were subtle, almost invisible unless you were the one standing on the outside looking in. On Tuesday morning, I stopped by the grocery store where I had shopped for nearly 20 years. As I pushed my cart down the cereal aisle, I spotted a familiar face. It was Linda Harper, a longtime family friend. Normally, she would have greeted me with a hug and asked about my garden. Instead, she offered a tight smile and quickly turned her attention to the shelves. I told myself I was imagining it. But later, when I reached the checkout line, I saw her glance in my direction twice before leaving without saying goodbye. That evening, I sat in my living room with a blanket across my lap and began replaying recent months in my mind. One memory led to another, then another, like pieces of a puzzle slowly sliding into place. 3 months earlier, Ethan had canceled our monthly lunch at the last minute. Vanessa had said he was busy. 2 months earlier, I had not been invited to a neighborhood barbecue hosted by friends who usually included me. At the time, I assumed it was an oversight. Now I was no longer sure. By Thursday afternoon, my suspicion had grown into something harder to ignore. I opened my social media account and began scrolling through photographs. Birthday parties, school events, weekend outings. There were dozens of moments I had never known about. Gatherings where nearly everyone in the family had been present except me. The realization settled heavily in my chest. This had not started at that Sunday dinner. That dinner had simply been the public conclusion too. Something that had been happening quietly behind the scenes. The next clue came unexpectedly. On Saturday morning, I attended a church fundraiser downtown. I had volunteered there for years. As I arranged donated items on folding tables, I noticed 2 women speaking nearby. They did not realize I could hear them. One of them mentioned Vanessa by name. The other sighed and said, "I feel bad for her." Imagine putting up with a mother-in-law like that for so many years. My hands froze. Neither woman sounded cruel. In fact, they sounded sympathetic. They genuinely believed Vanessa was a victim. I continued working without reacting, but inside, something shifted. Until that moment, I had assumed a handful of family members had heard her version of events. Now I understood the truth. The story had spread far beyond our home. People who barely knew me had already formed opinions. As I drove home that afternoon, rain tapped softly against my windshield. I thought about confronting Ethan. I imagined calling him and demanding answers. But every version of that conversation ended the same way. He would defend Vanessa. He would tell me I was overreacting. He would ask me to be patient. So instead, I chose silence. Not because I was weak. Not because I had accepted what was happening. Because for the first time, I realized I did not fully understand the game being played around me. And if I wanted the truth, I needed to stop talking and start listening. Somewhere, buried beneath all the rumors and half-truths, there was a reason Vanessa had worked so hard to turn people against me. I did not know what that reason was yet, but I intended to find out. Once I made the decision to stop defending myself and start paying attention, memories began resurfacing in ways I could not ignore. I found myself sitting at my kitchen table one evening with an old photo album open in front of me. The photographs told a story very different from the one people seem to believe now. There was Ethan at 10 years old holding a fishing rod almost taller than he was. There was his high school graduation. There was the day he received the keys to his first car, a used sedan that I had helped him buy after working extra shifts for nearly a year. I turned page after page and noticed something strange. Every important moment in our family's history carried the same theme. Whenever Ethan needed support, I was there. Whenever life became difficult, I stepped in without hesitation. Yet somehow, that history had been erased or rewritten. I remembered when Ethan first introduced Vanessa nearly 12 years earlier. She was charming, confident, and ambitious. I genuinely liked her. During their engagement, I helped them plan the wedding. When unexpected expenses appeared, I quietly contributed money so they would not have to start their marriage under financial stress. Years later, when Ethan wanted to open his small consulting business, I used part of my retirement savings to help him secure office space. I never considered it a sacrifice. That is what family does. At least, that was what I believed. As I sat there looking through those photographs, another memory surfaced. About 4 years earlier, Vanessa had asked me to watch Noah every afternoon for nearly 6 months while she completed a professional certification program. I had gladly rearranged my schedule to help. Yet afterward, she rarely mentioned it. At the time, I assumed she was simply busy. Now I wondered if something else had been happening. The more I reflected, the more a pattern emerged. Vanessa rarely challenged me directly. Instead, she worked in quieter ways. If Ethan and I planned lunch together, she would suddenly have another commitment for him. If I suggested a family gathering, she would politely explain why another date worked better. If a disagreement occurred, she always appeared calm, while somehow leaving others with the impression that she had been wronged. None of these moments seemed important individually. Together, they painted a different picture. A picture I had never wanted to see. One rainy afternoon, I visited a storage closet and pulled out several boxes filled with old greeting cards, holiday letters, and family keepsakes. As I sorted through them, I noticed how often I had been the one reaching out. Birthday invitations, holiday planning notes, school event reminders. For years, I had been quietly holding everyone together. The realization was not comforting. It was heartbreaking, because if maintaining those connections required constant effort from only one person, perhaps they had been more fragile than I realized. As darkness settled outside my windows, I closed the final photo album and returned it to the shelf. I was no longer asking whether Vanessa's story was true. I already knew it was not. The question that mattered now was much bigger. Why had she spent years creating a version of me that barely resembled reality? And what did she gain from making everyone believe it? Somewhere in those missing answers was the truth I had been searching for. I could feel myself getting closer to it, even if I could not see it clearly yet. 3 days later, the first crack appeared in the version of reality Vanessa had built. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon while I was browsing gardening supplies at a home improvement store across town. I had just loaded a few flower bulbs into my cart when I heard someone call my name. At first, I did not recognize the woman approaching me. She was in her mid-30s, dressed casually, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Then she smiled. "Helen," she asked. "It is Megan. Megan Ross." The name immediately sounded familiar. Vanessa had mentioned a Megan years ago, back when she and Ethan were newly married. They had been close friends at one point. I returned her smile, and we spent a few minutes exchanging polite conversation near the garden center. Eventually, Megan's expression changed. Her smile faded slightly. "I have actually been meaning to reach out to you for a long time," she said. Something in her tone made me pay attention. We moved to a small coffee shop located inside the store. Once we sat down, she wrapped both hands around her paper cup and stared at the table for several seconds. It was obvious she was choosing her words carefully. "I know this may sound strange," she finally said, "but I think there are things you should know." My heart began beating a little faster. For the next hour, Megan shared stories I had never heard before. Years ago, before Vanessa met Ethan, she had experienced a falling out with another group of friends. According to Megan, the situation began the same way. Small misunderstandings, private complaints, emotional conversations. Eventually, several people stopped speaking to one another. Relationships ended. Friendships collapsed. At the center of every conflict was Vanessa. I am not saying she planned everything, Megan said carefully. But she had a way of making herself look like the injured party. People wanted to protect her. They rarely questioned her version of events. I listened without interrupting. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Megan continued. At first, I believed everything she told me. Most of us did. Then I started noticing contradictions. She explained how different people had been given different versions of the same story. Small details changed depending on the audience. Facts shifted. Timelines moved. Somehow Vanessa always remained the victim. When Megan finally confronted her years earlier, the friendship ended almost immediately. As she spoke, pieces of my own experience began fitting together in ways they never had before. This was not about one argument. It was not about one family dinner. It was about influence, perception, control. Before we left, Megan reached into her purse and handed me a folded piece of paper. I wrote down a few names, she said quietly. People who might remember some of what happened back then. I accepted the paper but did not look at it right away. We stood near the entrance and said goodbye. As I walked back to my car, a cold autumn wind swept across the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than sadness. I felt clarity. Not certainty, not proof, but clarity. Someone else had seen a similar pattern long before I did. As I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced at the folded paper resting on the passenger seat. Whatever answers I had been searching for, I suddenly suspected they were much closer than I realized. After meeting Megan, I stopped thinking like a hurt mother and started thinking like someone trying to understand a complicated problem. For several days, I sat at my kitchen table every morning with a notebook, a cup of coffee, and the growing feeling that important pieces of the story were missing. The paper Megan had given me contained 3 names. I decided to call the first person. Her name was Rebecca. At first, she sounded hesitant. We spoke politely for several minutes before she finally relaxed enough to talk openly. What she told me was not dramatic. In fact, that was what made it believable. Rebecca described situations from years ago when Vanessa had shared concerns about friends and coworkers. The details were always small. Someone had excluded her. Someone had spoken harshly. Someone had treated her unfairly. Yet later, when people compared notes, they realized they had each heard slightly different versions of the same events. Rebecca emphasized that she was not accusing Vanessa of lying. She simply found the pattern unusual. After the call ended, I wrote down everything I could remember. The next day, I contacted another name from Megan's list. This conversation lasted nearly an hour. Again, the story felt familiar. Different people, different circumstances. The same result. Relationships became strained because individuals believed completely different versions of the same situation. When I hung up, I opened an old storage box in my hallway closet. Inside were years of family records, birthday invitations, Christmas cards, school event schedules, printed emails. Most people throw those things away. I never did. That evening, I began comparing dates. One detail immediately caught my attention. Vanessa had told several relatives that I stopped attending family events shortly after my husband passed away. Yet I found photographs from Thanksgiving, Easter, and Noah's school programs during that exact period. In every picture, I was there, smiling, participating, present. The following afternoon, I discovered something even more interesting. While searching through old emails, I found a message from Vanessa thanking me for helping with Noah 3 afternoons a week while she completed a certification course. The email was warm and appreciative, yet according to stories that had circulated. Recently, our relationship had supposedly been tense and difficult during that same period. The timelines did not fit. The facts did not fit. For the first time, I had something more substantial than feelings. I had documentation. 2 days later, another unexpected piece arrived. Carol called and mentioned a conversation she remembered from several years earlier. Vanessa had told her one version of a disagreement. Months later, she shared a different version with someone else. Carol never thought much about it until now. Hearing that gave me something important. Independent confirmation. Not proof of malicious intent. Not proof of deception. But proof that inconsistencies existed. By the end of the week, my notebook was full. Dates, emails, photographs, messages. None of them seemed powerful on their own. Together, however, they painted a very different picture from the one people had accepted. I sat back in my chair and looked across my quiet kitchen. Outside, leaves drifted across the lawn in the cool Ohio wind. For the first time since that painful dinner at Ethan's house, I felt steady. The truth was no longer something I believed. It was something I could show. The more evidence I gathered, the more careful I became. I did not want to rush toward conclusions. I had spent months watching people accept assumptions as facts. I refused to make the same mistake. Instead, I focused on verification. Every email was matched to a date. Every photograph was connected to an event. Every memory was supported by something tangible whenever possible. During that process, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. One Saturday morning, I attended a community fundraiser at Noah's elementary school. I almost stayed home. Part of me still felt uncomfortable appearing anywhere Vanessa might be. In the end, I went because I wanted my life to continue. I spent most of the afternoon browsing tables and speaking with teachers. Near the gymnasium entrance, I spotted Vanessa talking with several parents. I had no intention of approaching her. As I moved through the crowd, however, I overheard part of a conversation. She was describing a family disagreement involving me. The details immediately caught my attention because they conflicted with records sitting in a folder on my dining room table. According to the story she was sharing, a particular disagreement had happened shortly after my husband passed away. Yet I knew from emails, photographs, and calendar entries that the event occurred almost a year later. The difference was significant. I remained where I was for only a few moments before quietly walking away. That evening, I reviewed my documents again. The discrepancy was not an isolated mistake. It matched a pattern I had already seen several times. Dates shifted. Context changed. Different audiences received different versions. A few days later, Carol called. Her voice sounded troubled. She admitted she had started comparing old messages after our recent conversations. What she found bothered her. In one family group chat, Vanessa claimed I chose not to attend a holiday gathering. In another conversation sent to a different relative, she explained that the gathering had been intentionally limited and that not everyone had been invited. Carol forwarded screenshots. I studied them carefully. Neither message seemed dramatic. Yet together they created a problem. Both explanations could not be true at the same time. For the first time, I realized other people were beginning to notice the inconsistencies without my involvement. I was no longer the only person asking questions. That mattered. A few days later, another relative reached out. Then another. None of them accused Vanessa of anything directly. They simply seemed confused. Different stories were colliding with one another. The more people compared notes, the more difficult it became to fit everything into a single coherent narrative. Through all of this, Ethan remained distant. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. Several times I considered calling him. Several times I picked up my phone and then set it back down. If I forced a confrontation too early, he would likely become defensive. People rarely abandon beliefs they have invested months protecting. I understood that now. Instead, I continued organizing my information. Every document went into a folder. Every message received its own section. By the end of the month, I had assembled a clear timeline stretching back several years. Looking at it spread across my dining room table one evening, I finally understood why I felt calmer than before. I was no longer trying to prove I was a good mother. I was no longer trying to convince people to trust me. I was simply preserving the truth exactly as it happened. And the more complete that record became, the harder it would be for anyone to ignore. Everything came together sooner than I expected. About 2 weeks after the school fundraiser, Ethan called me for the first time in nearly a month. His voice sounded strained. He explained that several family members had become confused after hearing different versions of the same stories from different people. There was going to be a family gathering the following Saturday at his house. He said everyone needed to clear the air. I agreed immediately. The entire week leading up to the meeting felt strangely calm. I was not nervous. I was not angry. For months, I had carried the weight of uncertainty. Now I had something much stronger than emotion. I had facts. On Saturday afternoon, I arrived exactly on time. The house looked the same as it always had. The maple tree in the front yard had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Children's bicycles rested near the garage. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary family gathering. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt different. Tense. Careful. Everyone seemed aware that something important was about to happen. Ethan greeted me politely, but without his usual warmth. Vanessa sat at the dining room table. Her expression was composed, confident. Around her were several relatives, including Carol and a few others who had heard pieces of the situation over the past months. For a while, the conversation remained polite. Then Ethan finally addressed the issue. He said everyone seemed to have heard different versions of events and that he wanted honesty from everyone involved. Vanessa spoke first. Calmly, smoothly, she repeated many of the same accusations she had made before. She described years of feeling judged and excluded. She spoke about misunderstandings and emotional strain. Several people nodded sympathetically. As she talked, I noticed something interesting. The details shifted slightly from the earlier versions I had heard. Small differences, new dates, new explanations. Nothing dramatic, but enough. When she finished, the room became quiet. For a moment, everyone looked at me. Months earlier, I might have tried to defend myself emotionally. This time, I simply opened the folder I had brought. I began with the easiest contradiction, a family gathering that Vanessa claimed I refused to attend. I showed the message proving I had never received an invitation. Then I moved to another example, an event she described as happening shortly after my husband's passing. Photographs and emails showed it occurred nearly a year later. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. They simply looked. One piece after another. One date after another. One message after another. The room grew quieter with each page. I was careful not to attack Vanessa. I never called her names. I never raised my voice. I only presented information. Facts have a way of speaking clearly when emotions finally step aside. At one point, Carol shared the conflicting messages she had discovered. Another relative mentioned hearing a completely different version of one story. Gradually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Vanessa's confidence began to fade. For the first time since all of this started, she looked uncertain. Ethan sat silently, staring at the documents spread across the table. The silence that followed felt completely different from the silence at that dinner months earlier. Back then, nobody questioned the accusations. Now people were questioning everything. And as I looked around the room, I realized the truth no longer needed my protection. It had finally begun protecting itself. No one spoke for several seconds after the last document was placed on the table. The silence felt almost unreal. Months earlier, I had sat in that same room watching people accept accusations without hesitation. Now those same people were staring at evidence that raised questions none of them could ignore. Ethan remained motionless. His eyes moved slowly across the papers spread before him. For the first time, he was not looking at Vanessa for answers. He was looking at the facts. Vanessa attempted to explain some of the inconsistencies. She said she had been emotional. She said certain details had become blurred over time. She said misunderstandings happen in every family. Perhaps they do. But misunderstandings usually create confusion. What lay before us showed a pattern. The room understood that. Nobody needed to say it out loud. One by one, relatives began asking simple questions. Calm questions. Reasonable questions. Why had different people heard different versions of the same events? Why had timelines changed? Why had certain conversations been described differently depending on who was listening? The more questions appeared, the harder it became to maintain a single explanation. I sat quietly through all of it. There was nothing left for me to prove. Eventually, Ethan pushed his chair back and stood near the window. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower across the neighborhood. I could see the reflection of the maple tree moving gently in the glass. He stayed there for a long time before speaking. When he finally turned around, he looked older than I remembered. Not physically older, just tired, deeply tired. He apologized, not with dramatic speeches or emotional promises, just a simple apology. He admitted that he should have asked questions. He admitted that he had accepted one version of events without hearing the other. Hearing those words did not erase the pain of the previous months. Some wounds require time, but honesty has a way of creating space for healing. After that, the conversation slowly shifted. People spoke openly. Assumptions were corrected. Memories were compared. Stories that had once seemed certain suddenly looked very different. By early evening, the gathering began to break apart. Family members collected coats and exchanged quiet goodbyes. Nobody seemed eager to continue arguing. The truth had already done its work. As I prepared to leave, Noah ran over and wrapped his arms around me. It was such a simple gesture, but it nearly brought tears to my eyes. Children often see things more clearly than adults. They notice who shows up. They remember who stays. Outside, the air felt crisp and cool. I walked slowly toward my car and paused before opening the door. For months, I had imagined what victory might look like. I thought it would feel dramatic, triumphant. Instead, it felt peaceful, quiet, almost ordinary. Because the real victory was not exposing someone. It was reclaiming myself. I had spent too much time wondering how others saw me. Too much time trying to understand why people believe things that were not true. In the end, the answer mattered less than I expected. What mattered was remaining steady long enough for the truth to catch up. As I drove home beneath the fading autumn sky, I realized something important. Trust can be misplaced. Reputations can be damaged. Families can lose their way. But truth has patience. It does not rush. It does not shout. It simply waits. And sooner or later, if you allow it enough room, it speaks for itself.